Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of the magazine, and I'm not feeling all that great today, so you probably won't hear too much from me. But to compensate for me, I have with me Murray Dahm, the assistant editor at Ancient Warfare, and Mark DeSantis and Mark McGaffrey. And together we're going to talk about what to do if you're an Ancient Warfare fan and you have lots of time over the holidays. Are there any good new videos you could watch, or documentaries or movies or books you could read, or something that was, released by the BBC maybe half a century ago, and it's suddenly back now on a streaming service and you should really watch it. And hopefully we'll have some suggestions for you if you want some, you time with Ancient Warfare.
Taking some me time with Ancient Warfare. I like it. Well, first of the list, of course, and not to be nepotistic, is current issues and back issues of Ancient Warfare magazine, which of course you can absolutely get hold of and read. And shock horror. That's what I suggest is your first stop. But I'm going down. I'm going down the
Christmas bonus.
Excellent. I'm going down the paper route myself, which I shall explore soon. What about you, Mark? And Mark, what are you going to look at for our?
I've likewise gone down the paper route in terms of looking at sort of new trends in terms of literature coming out, but at the same time, it sort of links into one of the series that's just come out, something that we've actually broached in one of the previous podcasts before, but now is back with a second series. So nice. That's one area that I'm going to.
And what about you, Mr. DeSantis?
I intend to spend what little free time I have over the holidays going through all of my older Osprey titles that deal with the ancient world. They're very enjoyable, and I read 10 or 12 of them a month, I would say. But I'm going to be spending a lot of time actually over the holidays going over them.
Fantastic. All right. Well, then.
There'll be some new ones coming. I just want to, come on, if we're plugging, it is Christmas. We can plug. I mean, Murray's too modest to do it for himself anyway.
Are there any new titles coming out?
There are some new ones
the ancient
coming
world? Just wondering.
By certain Murray.
There are a couple. There might be one by me. But yes, no, there are a few. So we can explore all of that. So let's therefore start with what we can watch. So, Mark, what were you going to tie into?
I'll start with the literature and then go into the tie-in for my work better than the pick that I made was something that's come out in the last couple of years. It sort of ties into classics overall in terms of latest trends. Of course, is sort of bringing in the sensory experience of the ancient world, and of course, this is something that lots of people looked at, whether it's sight, sound, hearing, studying things like, for example, looking at places like the Forum in Rome and saying what would be the sensory experiences of walking through the Forum in a typical day, or alternatively being there for a theoretical nighttime experience of a funeral cortege coming through, and the whole how does the topography of the landscape actually influence what you're going to experience in all those ways. But of course, that sort of made a little bit of a move across from just classics in general to warfare, as we'll sort of look at it. This is a publication by Conor Whiteley, a sensory experience of the ancient warfare. I don't know if we can see that, or it's there. We'll put up the details on later on. But of course, this is sort of looking at it's got its ups and downs, I've got to say, because of course you're sort of studying, right, looking at particular battles, and the battles that, in this particular volume, it picks 6 particular battles and says what would be the sensory experience that a soldier would be going through. How is that going to influence the outcome of battles? The 6 battles that they look at: Canaxa, Issus, Cannae, Sieges of Jerusalem, and Masada, Battle of Strasbourg, and the Siege of Edessa. So it's going right throughout Roman history and Greek history as well. But the problem is that it does delve a little bit into the what ifs of the battle scene, and even when it sort of goes to talking about what what details do we get from the ancient sources? Are they giving us any particular details about the sensory experience? What a soldier's going to hear? What are they going to feel? What's going to get in their way? How is that going to influence them on the battlefield? How is it going to motivate or make them afraid? It's all a little bit what if. And even with the, you're sort of saying, well, the ancient sources, they're speculating to a certain extent when they're delving into these feelings. And then at the same time, we've got another layer of that delving into a little bit of fiction. I mean, my thought is, of course, coming out in the media at the moment, or in recent months, has been the second series of Barbarians, which of course focused on the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. And of course, the Varian disaster of Rome. And for that first season, it was great. We went through it in a separate podcast to trying to work out how long ago that was, but Murray probably
during COVID,
knows
so
exactly.
about 23 years ago.
Okay. I mean, that first season was great, but again, it's on the one hand, a series like that delves into the soldier's experience and goes into, the individuals on either side. And of course, that gives us an even better view when it brings in the linguistic element, because they've got this, the different languages being spoken on film. So it's adding to that sensory experience. So what's more valuable, going to watch a series like Barbarians, or going through a book like the one I've just mentioned, where there's a lot of speculation there? I think both are sort of worth their time in terms of delving into, and it raises a lot of possibilities and thoughts about battles that sometimes people sort of overlook. It's a good thing, I would say, in terms of gets the mind going on both topics. So they're my picks.
When I watch something like that, it's always, I basically go back and look at the source material. So, which is truly tragic in one sense, that, you're watching a documentary and then you go and read the original sources that they've made the documentary from. And you're like, wait a minute, where did you get that from? Which is, I remember watching, what was it? It was a John Wayne World War II Marine. It must have been Sans Iwo Jima or something like that. And that basically made me go out and buy the Airfix Marines plastic soldier set, which ages me. And that was just the kind of inspiration. And it sort of moved on from that to ancient warfare in terms of looking at actual history and, finding the books that you want to read and the sources and the modern analyses and things like that. So that, that's a way of being inspired.
I mean, in this book, he uses the introduction to actually look at the Varian disaster as his first introduction to this concept. And it's interesting when you sort of have him describe, the formations of the Trid by the terrain and by the woods, etc. And of course, this is coming straight from Dio Cassius. But of course, that's always up for, interpretation. How much are they being constrained? Exactly, how much is this going out of the normal? How much can a legion really, how flexible can it really be? And again, that interpretation is given to you, of course, in a series like Barbarians in a very, fixed manner. Likewise, in terms of the weather conditions that they experience, that, how much does that go towards the influence of the outcome of the battle? Again, you look at the sources, Dio Cassius, and then look at a secondary source like this. And again, it's all being interpreted, but still with a bit of leeway to it. And again, you go to the Barbarian series, and wonderful, how can I say, emotive final scene there of the storm hitting and whatnot. But again, but I guess, the main thing is it all gets you taking into consideration all these different aspects. And hopefully, as Murray says, goes back and actually look into more of the details for yourself.
Well, I think that's one of the big differences of, obviously, from the historian as opposed to the casual consumer, is that they see Gladiator or any other piece or Barbarians and they go, right, that's what happened. And then the historians go, hang on a minute, well, let's look at where that came from and that sort of deeper analysis. And of course, in between, you get the people who want to find out the deeper analysis from watching it. Sort of like in this series, we ask the important questions: how much legion does a legion liege, and how much barbarian does a barbarian barb? So it's kind of like well, those aren't questions. Hang on a minute. Now, I was going through to add to the Barbarians, which you can watch over the holiday period, the fact that Amazon Prime has released a whole series of older documentaries on ancient world, which are now available on streaming services for the first time, which means you can go back and watch, documentaries from 2006 and even earlier, which is great because in most cases, those documentaries really do still stand up. And a bit like, we sit there and go, yes, but it's a documentary from 2005. It's 20 years old. It's like, yes, but the latest,
before Ancient Warfare magazine, Mark.
Well, exactly. But the interesting thing about it is that in many ways, the scholarship on some of these subjects hasn't really moved on. You're dealing with books written in the 19th century in some cases, still being the cutting edge opinion on these things. So, a 20-year-old documentary, a 30-year-old documentary isn't actually that out of date, to be honest. And so in that case, you've got there's this Boudica, there's a new one, I think, on Arthur and Merlin, which is at the very end of the ancient warfare period, the first emperor. There's all sorts of things that you can just sort of find out whether it's of interest or not. And I think one of the great things about the streaming, of course, is if you don't like it, well, stop watching and look at something else. And there's so much around that you can take or leave in a way. But the funny thing about, like with the Michael Wood documentaries, and as we've sort of discussed off camera, all of them except In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great are available, which is like, well, why not that one? They're beautifully made and they still hold up.
Then if In Search of the Trojan War is available, I highly recommend that because it's a wonderful series. It's old, but it's spectacular. And I think that it's a step-by-step exploration, not only of the story of the Trojan War, but also how Troy was rediscovered after thousands of years, and just learning about the layers of the city and possibly what kind of city was at the center of the conflict that roiled around Troy. Was it a city of great palaces, or was it a city in more reduced circumstances? All very wonderful questions that Wood deciphers. So I would highly recommend that if you can find it anywhere.
We can maybe, if we're talking about video, there is a question. We have a few questions for this episode, and one of them is, we discussed it before, from Alex on Patreon. Patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Are there any movies or shows that accurately depict ancient warfare? Single combat seems to be anathema to large-scale ancient warfare. That's all we see on the screen. And I don't quite understand, because planting a camera in the middle of a phalanx seems like a built-in drama to me. And I'm sure he doesn't mean the drama of all the historians whacking each other over the head with what that phalanx would have actually looked like. Do we have anybody recommend any movie, any documentary where you go, that's where it really looked good?
The funny thing about that, is I think when you look at films, even when they stand in formation, and that's a rarity, soon devolves into one-on-one combat melee. And the famous quincunx of Spartacus in 1960 again devolves into one-on-one combats. One of the best for me is actually a 1936 film made in fascist Italy called Scipio Africanus, where they don't have any OH&S or workplace health and safety concerns, and they're standing in ranks having spears thrown at them, which again is it's a major facet of Roman warfare. But because you're making a documentary where you need to keep people safe, no one throws anything. They just advance with spears or swords, as opposed to this was dangerous. So that's a bizarre one. And in fact, in documentaries, it's very, very seldom done. The phalanx, even in Alexander the Great from 2004, the film doesn't quite get it right. They're too far apart, but again, as you say, Jasper, you're just going to get arguments. So in fact, it's probably more interesting to have No,
Who
I
gets
think it'd actually
closest?
literally would be more interesting to have a phalanx on each side of academics who support atheismos versus non-atheismos and just have them at it. That would be a more interesting documentary. But yeah, I don't think any documentary really gets to the heart of what it was like in the face of Roman or Greek battle. You know, and we generally have one side or the other, not both. And even so, mock combat or reenactor combat is not combat. You are not actually trying to, although, again, there was a wonderful thing that came out with Braveheart, that the units they used to reenact the battles in Braveheart were two modern units dressed up in costume. And they basically went at each other. And there are still scenes in that where they just run at one another without any thought of personal safety. And they just clash. And you're like, oh, wow, that's a bit visceral. And I wonder whether that's actually possibly one of like the most accurate modern depictions of like, oh, they don't even slow down. That's crazy. So, you know, it's a tricky one.
The difficulty I have with answering what is an accurate depiction of ancient warfare is that do we really even know what ancient warfare looked like to get and I'm not saying that we can't have
philosophical but good
some
one.
ideas, but for example, that is we think, oh, this is how people fought with swords, and I've come across this interesting bit in which it was said that in sword fights, a swordsman would try to, if he had to block another sword with his sword, he would use the flat of his blade, not the edge, because he wouldn't want to get a nick or a gouge inside the edge, because that would become a fracture point, and that's dangerous for your blade. Something I didn't know, but it doesn't look like something that's ever portrayed in any form of sword combat I've ever seen in a movie before.
Was that on a Forged in Fire episode? It sounds like
I don't know. I just came across that, and I thought, interesting. I mean, and for example, there's no one alive today who's ever been anywhere near an ancient war battlefield. So, whereas at least with World War II warfare or more recent wars, there's someone around who can say that's not what it was like, and yet film depictions still get it wrong. I would say that we can make suppositions, reasonable suppositions as to how wars were fought, but there's a lot that we'll never really know. But we can get close, but we'll never know if we're entirely accurate, because that would presume that we have some sort of source that can show us. We have a video from one of Caesar's battles.
It goes to show, really, that, as dated as they might seem now, the Michael Wood style documentaries actually probably get the closest to, really examining battlefield and campaign conditions, because, in terms of being, visiting the locations, seeing what the difficulties are. I recall that, I can't recall which episode it is, when he's actually looking at the Alexander's crossing of the Hindu Kush, and actually saying, right, actually, in terms of actually looking at the ability of the troops to deal with altitude, that they actually acquired, local knowledge in terms of the dietary changes to actually help them cope. Just looking at those sort of details, and actually that sort of goes back to that, that sensory approach of saying, right, what is the experience? There was another documentary actually jumps to mind, done by the Wood brothers from Newcastle, Australia, my hometown, so I give them great credit. Done on Hannibal back in 2012. Where they did, I believe the title was On Hannibal's Trail. I think it's on YouTube still. And of course, being, two of them at least, very into their cycling, they decided to actually, of course, follow again, doing the sort of Michael Wood style documentary, but this time on two wheels, followed from Spain all the way round on Hannibal's campaign trail, again, the whole experience of location as you move along. So I think, as much as we might say, okay, that was sort of the 90s approach and documentaries have moved on, I think that's probably as valuable as they come, really.
Yeah. I think the other thing which all of that ties into is I find inspiration for insight into ancient warfare and ancient history in general wherever I can get it. I've blogged about it in the past, standing on a beach in Australia.
We've noticed, Murray.
Yeah, I know. And understanding, getting an insight into the Battle of Sphacteria, because there was an island off the shore of the beach I was on going, oh, that reminds me, and I think, looking at a documentary or looking at a film, even an unrelated film, can really go, oh, hang on a minute, that gives me pause to think about this aspect of ancient warfare or this aspect of ancient history. And I think that sort of taking inspiration, even as you say, Mark, we can't know because there's no one left alive, even though some of us may feel it some days that we perhaps lived through some of the ancient battles. That gives me an insight into what the source says or the way that they describe it. And I think that that's certainly worth positing and pondering, either out loud or in print. So I think that's one of the things is find inspiration where you can get it. And run with it and see how far it goes. I mean, that's generally what we do as academics. Anyway, some of us run further than we should with our ideas, but that's okay. Anyway, I was going to talk about ancient fiction, which again is something that you can spend your time in the holidays on. And you might sit there and go, well, it's a very niche world, ancient military fiction. And then you do a search on Goodreads saying, give me a list of all the ancient warfare novels released in 2022. And you get the top 100 in, 0.4 seconds. So there are hundreds of new novels being released every year set in the ancient world. Now, they might not all be to your taste. And lots of them are based on Greek mythology. Electra by Jennifer Saint, for instance, and I'm just going to choose a few titles here. Then, of course, Wrath of the Picts. That's clearly far more ancient warfare based, and that's Stephen Mackay, I'm not sure. Warrior Druid of Britain, number 5. So obviously 5 in a series. So if you really like them, there's many more you can read. The Casparius, Legion 22 by Simon Turney, which is the warrior and combat medic Titus Servanius fighting an uprising in Egypt. The Third Daughter, which is talking about the Third Daughter, Tertulia, born to the Junius family on the Palatine Hill. Queens of Themyscira, the Grecian Women Trilogy, number 3 by Hannah Lynn. And what have we got? The Wall by Douglas Jackson. So, AD 400. So there's an absolutely vast array of new fiction set in the ancient world, and all across from there's Near Eastern novels, there's Greek, there's Roman, there's late Roman, there's everything you could possibly want in a Roman fiction world. And I know that not necessarily everyone's cup of tea is ancient fiction. But like I just said, you can get your inspiration wherever you can find it. So I find a good novel about the ancient world is inspirational in a way to send you back to the sources and reread. There's a new novel by Julian Barnes about the Emperor Julian, just been released this year, which interestingly sent me back to read Gore Vidal's Julian, which is one of my favorite ancient warfare, ancient history novels in general. So I think again you can find new material, and again it's a little bit fraught because obviously they might not be an author you like, but then they might be. So you can sample them. You can read sample chapters online these days and reviews, and if you agree with the reviewer, you can find their material and go, oh, well, I really like. If you like X, you'll like Y, kind of stuff. If you like Livy, then you'll like Douglas Adams. So, that sort of thing. Although, as Jasper often tells me, you can't write sentences like Livy because they're far too long. So, all those subclauses don't work in English. But, parentheses, Murray, why are you so much in love with the brackets? Anyway, so I think that, there's lots of ancient novels that are written. You can, spend time with a book, which is always to me a sign of the holiday when you actually have the time and the inclination to actually sit somewhere with a book on a beach in a backyard in bed is always a fabulous sort of way to spend your time. So there's all manner of new ancient fiction out there if you would like to go and look.
I would chuck into that. I don't think it got mentioned there, but Natalie Haynes has got a new one out, Stone Blind, and if it's, I've got to say that's my aim for this coming holiday. I'm going to be grabbing a copy of that very soon, because if anything of her previous books is to go by, usually a very good adaptation of either mythological, or in one case, if you've read Thousand Ships, which was her take on the Trojan War from a more feminine perspective of the female characters, which often get sidelined, but actually she's gone on a different perspective of what do they experience through the entirety of the war. Likewise, Children of Jocasta is a great novel itself, again, by Natalie Haynes. So, a couple of picks there.
Oh, no, I'm reading our chat. In Search of the Trojan War is indeed available on Amazon Prime, as is In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great on Amazon.com, not the UK, alas, alack. So, yes, so there we go. Welcome.
And we have a new
Lindsay.
participant.
We
Yeah,
do.
Lindsay Powell just showed up. Hooray.
Hello.
We're in books, Lindsay.
I might throw you on the deep end, Lindsay.
Okay, my books. Well, I actually just reviewed for, I think it's going to be Ancient Warfare, right? Peter Stottart's Crassus, the First Tycoon. Peter Stottart's written a couple of other books, one of which was about the assassination of Julius Caesar, which was, I think, very well received. This one is interesting because it's about one individual who normally doesn't get a lot of press, and when he does, it's actually very bad press, like Marcus Licinius Crassus, of course. I'm interested because in my day job, I'm actually helping entrepreneurs and people who do build business. And this was ancient Rome's mega million. He was the Elon Musk, if I can be provocative, of the ancient world, and just as popular. Yeah. So the great thing about this book, which I think comes out in the review, is it's very short. It's only 168 pages, and it's very easy to read. Covers basically the dying decades of the late Roman Republic, and it's not one which is just peppered with footnotes. So that if you're like me, you live in footnotes. This is really intended to be read. And if you really want the end notes, you can kind of go look those at the back. So it's very much a narrative biography, very easy to read. And I think he really does a great job of trying to rehabilitate this man, not necessarily hero worshipping him, not at all. Very much a warts and all account using all the ancient sources. His breakthrough, as it turns out, was actually allying with Sulla, which was partly by accident as much as anything else, and then finding himself with the small army that he'd brought with him from Spain, and at the Battle of Colline Gate helps basically make the city available, ousting the Marians, and by doing that finds favor with Sulla, and in the auctions and prescriptions after that is able to make his fortune by buying property cheap. So he's not very lovable from that point of view because, of course, he makes his fortune out of people's misfortune. But it's just really interesting. The guy was an entrepreneur in ancient days. He was a property speculator. He was a mine and quarry owner. He organized his slaves apparently almost on the Roman army basis of centuries and cohorts. They were trained to do very specific jobs. They went out and did those jobs very well. And we would actually these days call it sort of management, organization, and methods. So he was an early proponent of that. His ultimate fiasco, of course, which is famously his ridiculous invasion of Parthia, which nobody thought was a great idea at the time, was really influenced because his peers, who of course would be Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar, had garnered great military kudos by their campaigns in Asia and in Gaul. And he thought, well, in order to be accepted by my peers and taken serious, I need to have a victory. He just chose the wrong animal to fight. And of course, we know the whole thing as the Battle of Crassus. So I recommend that book. I have to say, a very good one, very short.
Christmas afternoon?
If you really are a voracious reader, but I actually just enjoyed the way he wrote. So I took my time over the words. I mean, I'm a writer. I actually think people should spend time reading the words rather than just the idea. The other one, which I'm in the process of reading, is my friend Adrienne Mayer's Greek Fire. You can read the title. It's Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs. Adrienne always likes long titles. Subtext is Unconventional Warfare in the Ancient World. This is a revised version of a book that she wrote several years ago, which proved to be groundbreaking because what it highlighted is things that we think are new, i.e. use of toxins and all sorts of related things like naphtha and fire and whatever, is not a new invention. In fact, goes all the way back to the earliest forms of warfare. And she's gathered all of this stuff in a really quite compelling book, which deservedly is now a revised and updated version, has a new preface. It has actually been made into episodes of TV programs as well, where they've done experiments with some of the things she describes in here. So well done, Adrienne Bayer. I recommend that one. And if I'm allowed a third one, I cheekily was watching the flow of conversation on what remains of Twitter to find that people were singing the praises of a new book by Josiah Osgood. It's called Uncommon Wrath. And this book basically is about Julius Caesar and Cato, and how those two people's interactions actually promoted the decline and collapse of the late Roman Republic. So they've sent me the PDF. I'm going to be reading that. They're sending me a hard copy as well, so well done.
Is that
my initial survey of this?
Analogy for Twitter, I suppose? Uncommon.
Again, Josiah Osgood, a first-rate scholar, has written several books, and I think has probably even written for our magazine, maybe. But his style is very straightforward, very easy, non-technical, and even where it gets technical, he explains those things. So I'm looking forward to reading that in the new year. And I'll tell you about my video choices later.
Well, we were going to mention up-and-coming things that you could do, and we, some new non-fiction, since we've talked about fiction and documentaries. And there's several things. Obviously, MC Bishop's Plate Mail has just been released, as in last week, 24th of November. That got released, which is, I'm sure some of you have probably already read it, because a book by the specialist on Roman plate mail about Roman plate mail, very exciting. Well, yes. So there's several new titles, both from Pen and Sword and Osprey, that have been released on Ancient Warfare. There's one coming up in January on King Arthur and post-Roman Britain, which is certainly on my reading list. And then there's a couple of others, which other people might have on their lists. Where are we? There's what's it called? Come on. Roman army units in the eastern provinces in the 3rd century. Someone may have written a book on the Hunnic warrior and late Roman cavalryman, which came out in September, if you haven't bought that already. And having just spoken about Crassus, of course, there was a new campaign on Carrhae in 53 BC, one on gladiators by Francois Gibert, one on the triremes, the Greco-Persian Wars, Athenian trireme versus Persian trireme. And we sort of made the point, how do you differentiate between an Athenian trireme and a Persian trireme?
Seems difficult, but yeah.
Indeed. And William Horsted wrote one on the British Celtic warrior versus Roman soldier in the combat series, which of course is similar to Lindsay's combat series on the Roman legionary versus Germanic warrior back in the day.
Just to point out for the people who may not know that the idea between the combat series is really to see battle, or actually the idea is to actually have a campaign with 3 battles, and you see it from both perspectives. So the highlight of the book is the artist actually picks a moment in a battle, and you see it both from the proponent and the opponent. And the text that the writer comes up with is setting all the background and opposing forces and stuff. And it's kind of a cool, neat idea. And I think they've got all periods of history basically represented now. Mine was number 6.
They're up to about 75 volumes of combat, going from ancient war all the way through to modern. I think Vietnam might be the most recent period. I don't think they've done anything more recent than that. But yes, no, they're an interesting. Of course, the interesting thing about them is that you've got to do the background to, organization, motivation, recruitment, training, and then analyze the 3 battles, each of which gets their own sort of.
Well, the great thing is you don't necessarily have to be even interested in any one particular period. But the great thing about the style and approach, because it's a template model, really, is that you could read all about human history through warfare just by reading all of the books. And you'd get a wonderful sense of the the evolution of battle tactics and all the rest of it, and fighting, and actually also an appreciation how a lot of things stay the same.
Well, it's funny when you're trying, as a military historian, to bring in the other aspects of history that are important, whether it be economics or politics or religion. For instance, in the late Roman period, I've found myself mentioning the conflict between Aryan and Nicene Christianity as being a real fermenter of military conflict.
But the readers didn't expect that one.
No, and you're like, well, actually, this is the most important part here. Like the Battle of Adrianople, for instance, the Goths are all Christian, which is, again, not the way it's framed. We normally view barbarians as pagan barbarians. And you're like, well, when the Goths crossed into the Roman Empire, they became Christian. And in fact, some had been Christian already, but they were Aryan Christians. And of course, in the late 4th century, there's a massive conflict between the Aryans and the Nicenes, or what we call today, Orthodox Catholic Christianity. And which is why we still say the Nicene Creed, everybody. Well, not everybody, but some of us still say the Nicene Creed. So interestingly that really drives the conflict between them, because they're persecuting one another. So it's not pagan and Christian persecution, it's Christians persecuting Christians. And Valens, the emperor who's defeated at the Battle of Adrianople, is an Aryan Christian. And when he's replaced by Theodosius, they go to great lengths to find a Nicene Christian candidate to go on the throne rather than an Aryan. And again, in the wars between Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire and the Vandals are all Aryan Christians. And so a lot of that conflict is actually driven by the fact that they're excluded from Easter celebrations in 536 because they're Aryan. And so it's you can really frame it as a religious conflict rather than simply a military one. So, as with many things in history, that everything is intertwined and everything is hand in hand. Even though some of us like to look at swords and spears.
That's almost on that bombshell, Murray, but Lindsay promised that he had some videos for us. He did.
Well, I think the request that our group producer put out to us was basically a very open-ended thing about including documentaries. We got into a discussion about that. And so because I've cut the cord, my access to material is much reduced. And I'm a great fan of PBS over here in the States, who actually rebroadcast I think it's British production, which is Secrets of the Dead, which I think is really as allowing for the things that are now acceptable as TV documentaries. I think they do a very good job. They don't sensationalize the stuff. They do a good job of setting the background of a particular issue. They talk to experts. They present things fairly, and they kind of logically build up their case. You may not agree with the findings, but it's a great piece of TV for about an hour. So there's a whole load of those you can go and find. If you're on PBS, there's the Passport series that you have access to. You can see them there. The other thing I was going to think is I have access to Amazon Prime and their sister broadcasting system called Freevee. There is the one person I really enjoy watching, who's Dame Mary Beard, who I think basically anything she produces I think is worth watching, because she's a classicist, not an archaeologist and historian, so she looks at things through the eyes of a classicist. So bear that in mind. She's just a great TV presenter. She is very compelling, and she's great at telling stories. So she's done a whole series of these things. She's done individuals, Julius Caesar. She's done one on Caligula, which are great. They come with a lot of travel, that she goes off to places. She rides bicycles and she wears a bright red coat and these really glittery sneakers, or trainers, as you will, which are her trademarks. But she has this really interesting way of humanizing the story and not over academicizing the thing, because there's always the temptation when you know a lot about stuff through a classical lens that you might kind of over address that, but she doesn't. She did one which was Rome, I think it's like the Beyond the Borders or something. I've got the title of it, which is great. It's about 3 or 4 episodes where she literally tells the story of Rome through the provinces, and you get to see a lot of the Roman Empire, just its diversity of country and cities and towns, and you learn about people that often don't get airtime, which is great. In fact, one of my books about Augustus at War talks about one individual. Another one in my Bar Kokhba book, I talked about another one, and they both got aired, which was really quite remarkable to me. I actually got to see in Timgad, or wherever this place was, the inscription that of this man, which was really quite a reveal. So I would recommend it. If you want to know classics and see it presented well, professionally done, check out your subscription services, see what is on of Mary Beard. And actually, you'll find some of the content is available free on YouTube as well. So you don't even have to pay for it. But I hope she continues to produce great programming. She's outstanding.
Well, now that she's retired, she has more time to make such things. So hopefully, yes.
Well, she's had a contract with the Beeb, I think BBC Two particularly, where she does like a chat show and she talks about a whole bunch of different stuff. Because she's become a celebrity as well as a sort of a professional classicist. Famously, she had an interview with Boris Johnson maybe 10 years ago, where they took the sides of who was better, ancient Greece or Rome, and she was the Romans and Boris was the Greeks, and it was an interesting intellectual discussion, not terribly rigorous, but it was just very interesting to hear those two people going at it. But I think what she's done is to make accessible what can sometimes seem very impenetrable. She hasn't popularized it in the sense of making it sort of like an education level of 10 or something. She speaks to you as an equal, but makes it very compelling. I mean, you go into the catacombs and you go into backs of temples and whatever that you would maybe not normally see.
I find most of hers just make me jealous that she gets to travel to all these far-flung places. For
you need a red coat and sneakers.
Absolutely. Now, Matthias, watching live, hi Matthias, does not recommend season 2 of Barbarians, but we can all make our own minds up on that. And also asks if any of us have watched Roman Empire on Netflix, 3 series of Roman Empire on Netflix.
So I'm going to confess, I actually did have for a month the Netflix subscription because I wanted to see Operation Mincemeat and a few other great recently manufactured products. I looked at the trailer and went, ugh, and I stopped at that point.
Yeah, I think we've had Netflix for a longer time, but I've had a similar experience to Lindsay, and I fully recognize that may not be fair. It's just, you watch some of those things and you get this feeling in your gut, and then you go, I have other things to do that might be more worthwhile my time.
Well, Netflix is a commercial operation. They're about getting profitable paid subscribers. I get the business model. It's been very successful. I used to be a Netflix when I got the DVDs in the mail. The problem is that because it's a machine that needs to be fed and there's lots of competition, sometimes they come out with a very low bar as to what they think is going to make great TV. And I know you may have talked about Barbarians. I haven't even watched the first one because I just think the premise is ridiculous. I'm not going to give it a light of day. And I know I'm probably going to ostracize a lot of people who think it's really great. And I've heard a couple of people talk about my favorite Germanicus season. I would hate to know what they've done to his character. And then this other travesty, Apocalypse, Ancient Apocalypse. I mean, I don't know.
We'd gotten away with not mentioning that, actually.
Yeah.
So
Angus is cutting this out now live.
Yeah, right. But I think the interesting thing with all of those, whether you watch them or choose not to, is, as I said before, take your inspiration from where you can get it. If a documentary gets it wrong, you take personal responsibility in going over and finding out, well, what's actually right. If you think that documentary gets it right, great, but you might come across people who don't think that.
Well, of course, right. And then you subscribe to Ancient History and Ancient Warfare magazine, you find it's actually quite hard to find actually what happened, whether it was right or wrong, because actually, for all the reasons we explain in the magazines and these podcasts, it's not always clear. Again,
a bombshell that I could grab, but I want to, we have one more question. I want to honor it. And we've also not discussed this type of media. Tim from Patreon says that he's looking for recommendations for audiobook versions of Caesar's Gallic Wars and the Iliad and Odyssey. I'm a great fan of audiobooks because you can listen to them when you walk the dog. And if you have a dog, then you do a lot of walking. But I have to confess, I haven't looked for those. Does anybody have any good ones?
I know there's a good audiobook of the Fagles translation put out by Penguin of the Iliad.
Well, there's one, it's a sort of older recording, and I'm trying to find it desperately here. Charlton Griffin is the narrator, and you either like Charlton Griffin's delivery, which is very plummy, very sort of English and very paced. Doesn't always work for me, but I mean, it sounds very authoritative. And again, the translations could be old ones. They could be like 1920 or even earlier before that. One I particularly like is actually Tacitus, which is read by, is it David Timpson? Tacitus, the Histories. Maybe it's not that one, or maybe it's this one here. Crikey, talk amongst yourselves while I'm looking. Unfortunately, it's too. To be a successful audiobook, I think it hinges on those two things. It's the translation, because let's face it, some of the older translations really don't make a lot of sense to the modern ear. I mean, they seem to be almost literal translations, which
not
are
very
really hard.
accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. So you hope to have a more modern, naturalistic, as far as you can do that with the translation of an ancient text. But it also comes down to the narrator or voice talent. And there are one or two who are outstanding voice talents, and they can make really quite dull text sound really quite alive.
Mind you, I think it's also like Shakespeare, that if you get someone who doesn't actually understand Shakespeare, they can read it and it can sound incomprehensible. Whereas when you find a great Shakespearean actor, they will read Shakespeare, and even if you're not familiar with it, it will suddenly become comprehensible to you. And I think that's true. We did, like, if you read the Pope translation of the Iliad, it's very old-fashioned 17th century English. But if you get someone who knows how to read 17th century English to you, suddenly it becomes, and as you said before, you suddenly pay attention to the words and the poetry. And so I think it does very much rely on the who is reading it and how they're reading it.
I've got to admit that I'm not a fan of it.
The Pope translation.
No, I was going to say in terms of, no, not in terms of Pope, but I'm saying in terms of the audiobook, I mean, I would say that, getting it, as you're saying, a good translation, can really make the difference with the original sources. And subsequently, you get somebody like Shackelford and Bailey, who's translating, Cicero, which is, again, a very traditional approach to translating. But I find it's the footnotes that make it, and being able to sort of delve out of the text, in and out of the text, which I just don't, you can't necessarily do listening to an audiobook. So.
No, you miss out the commentary. That's true.
So two I'd highly recommend, and I know that they're not Julius Caesar's Gallic War, but I would highly recommend Julius Caesar, The Civil War, which you can get from Audible, read by Robin Field, who has an excellent voice and delivery. And I had always underestimated the Civil War as a piece of written history. I actually find it more interesting than the Gallic War, because it's Romans fighting Romans, and it's all the great generals, Pompeius Magnus and Julius Caesar. So I would highly recommend that one. And then the other one, in fact, is Suetonius 12 Caesars, read by Derek Jacobi, who, of course, you'll remember as Claudius and I Claudius. And he just brings this sort of amazing thespian, this Shakespearean actor to this older translation. And it's wonderful.
There is an audiobook of the Gallic Wars available on Audible.
I'm sure there's much more, and we'll just close on with two final remarks on that. I think Angus adds that Stephen Fry's retelling, I think is the best way to say it, of Troy is available on Audible and done by himself, read by Stephen Fry himself. And Angus also recommends a good version of the Iliad and Odyssey aimed at children and family listening. So if you don't want that me time, but you want to bring your whole family into the ancient world, there is a version adapted by Tony Robinson and read and performed by Tony Robinson and adapted by Richard Curtis, called Odysseus, the Greatest Hero of Them All. And that might just be fun for everyone.
So here's a Christmas activity. You grab yourself an ancient Greek play or a comedy and actually split the roles up with your family and have a go at dramatizing it over the Christmas holiday. Hey.
And if it worked, we want to know. If it was a disaster, please don't tell us.
Yeah.
I think on that bombshell, I wish you all a very happy Christmas, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. And we'll see you in 2023.